So Tim and I have been doing some work together. He's going to be doing a 3 hour intro program for us in a few weeks. And we thought it might be a great idea to have him do this community meeting presentation so you could sort of be introduced to him. Some of you, I think Carol said, I don't really know Tim. So let's offers you a taste of Tim, I guess. So in our work together, Tim, because we have been working for 6 weeks or so, do you want to share anything about what that's been like for you?
Yeah, I think in where do I even begin? I've had different experiences being mentored by and having friendships with a variety of people in the Satir community, and I've continuously learned a lot. And one of the things that I'm constantly trying to reconcile and work through is the relationship between roles and self, or hierarchy and structure, and what Virginia called the seed model. And I think there's a need to evolve this relationship between the hierarchy, between our roles and the seed. And so I think I've been experiencing that a lot with you, Linda. And I think we've been working, collaborating together to stay in contact with each other on a very human, maybe even spiritual level, one of connection and dignity and even love. So, anyways, there's a lot of learning, but essentially, it's the importance of practicing self-connection, and we can get into that, what that means more. But yeah, I don't know what, maybe you could share a little bit what you're comfortable to share by way of context, because I had suggested that maybe we could talk a little bit about our process, particularly what we learned about each other and what we learned for ourselves, as a way of appreciating one another. And then I think that would be a good flow into the dialogue. I think that our conversations together have been really rewarding, and challenging, but dynamic and alive, I think, in a way that's where the best stuff is. So I don't know what you want to add.
Yeah, well, I definitely have given this some thought. It was like, oh, so one of the things that kind of came out of like us working together, you know, and I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about Satir. Satir says that we're all unique manifestations of life force energy. So we're all unique. And in this uniqueness, we have to sort of know that we're going to have different differences. And sometimes people would call that conflict. And so she said that anytime that we experience this conflict, that it's an avenue for hope. And it's like, wow, that is really interesting. And so she goes on to say that this differentness, not differences, but differentness, is like a fantastic gift for each other. So in working with Tim, at one point early on, because we were having some differences, Tim's like, it sounds like you're conflict avoidant. I'm like, oh dear. It was like, that's probably like not good. So it's like, sort of like, and yet it is good because it's an avenue for hope. So we can learn, I can learn about myself. I can grow. I can see how I have, I have room to learn from Tim and to grow through this relationship from Tim. And I guess that ability to remember sort of like our tendernesses and sort of like love that about myself. It's like, yes, there is, and because she went on to say, as we learned how to deal with our conflicts, our differentness from our family of origin. So really being able to go on this sort of journey back of like, well, yeah, what did I learn? And what is that I get some anxiousness about, like, oh, we're seeing things differently. Somebody needs to be right or wrong. There's that hierarchy model. And like, how do we make decisions when a decision has to be made? So we had some discussion about what is collaboration, is agreement wrapped into collaboration. So it was really rich, and
Mhm.
I had some tears and you had your experience, and here we are
Yeah.
working together.
Yeah.
Which is truly the Satir model, I think, is that we can work through them and grow from these differences.
And what I want to appreciate about you is I think you were very resilient in um, being being true to those values. And you know, I was interested in, you know, regardless of the outcome, whether we agreed or not, that I wanted us to practice the things that we both have learned from Virginia in terms of how we communicate and how we see one another, how we can prioritize understanding, even though there might be a disagreement. That if we can work towards understanding, that's going to be tremendously valuable. And yeah, so I appreciate that about you. So at a very heart level, that was very meaningful for me, and actually quite healing, because I've had experiences where that didn't occur. And so thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks so much. Yeah, and it sort of speaks to what Jennifer read this morning about the mask, is like being in those moments of like, do I stay in the role that I was in with you, and how do I bring in myself? How do I just bring in me and sort of in a way let go of the role, because that life force connecting to life force is where I think it's important, most important. So I
Mhm.
appreciated your tenderness, your authenticity, your determination in our collaborating with each other on a
Mhm.
human level and on a spirit level. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So if it's okay, we'll go ahead and move into, I'll ask you a few questions.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Tim, how has Satir's work impacted your life personally and professionally?
Um, yeah, I think uh, I basically found out about Virginia from just reading a foreword she wrote in a book when I was still in grad school. And the title I suggested for this conversation was In Search of Virginia, because I think that's constantly what I've been doing, is trying to learn more from her, you know, watching video of her, and then studying on my own for 7 years, and then getting to do some workshops with SIP, and getting to experience it and interacting with people and experiencing it was really life changing. And so the personal and professional for me, there the lines are not clearly defined. To the extent that I've grown personally, it certainly impacted my ability to work more effectively as a therapist. Um, I think, you know, one of the biggest learnings for me is Virginia's um, emphasis on the body and sensation and of feeling and of touch, and how important that is to make an experience real. She would often say, you know, I want to make this a sight, a taste, a touch, you know, and so the sculpting was very important to that. So being able to do that and seeing how impactful and how um, in the immediacy of that with people, with families, being able to experience that was very powerful. But then it wasn't just a gimmick. It wasn't just a technique. It was very much tied to what we're talking about. Is very much tied to the heart. There's a genuine humanistic valuing and appreciation of the person. And I think her ability to touch people that I could observe through the video was something that inspired me, that I wanted to be able to make contact like that. And so that was a very inspiring model for me. And it inspires me and informs a lot of what I try to be as a partner, as a father. So yeah, I've learned a lot from her. Yeah.
So all the branches of your tree have gotten stronger or have more life in them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's tapped me into, I guess, an essence or a self, a spiritual self that I don't think I would have otherwise been able to contact. And I think sort of where I am now with Virginia's work is um, very much actively trying to dialogue with it. And when I read her work, I'm trying to look for how could what is this what else does this mean? How could this be clearer? How could we integrate it more? Because I think that it's you can see there's a kind of like magic in her work, but it's not so clearly understood. And I think from where I've learned and in conversations with people that have studied with her, there's such an important emphasis on the experiential, but I think there also needs to be a dialogue between the intellectual and the experiential. So the experiential and the intellectual, the left brain and the right brain coming together and being in this dynamic mapping. So that's what I'm interested in, never losing sight of the experiential, never losing sight of the body, but having more anchor points to clarify her work. And that has a lot to do with language. So that's been an important part of my study, is trying to understand, what is she pointing at with her words? What exactly does she mean?
Yeah, and it's like when you talk about the magic, it seems like the magic is the life energy, and we all have the life energy. So she did say she doesn't want people to be Satyrian. She wants people to really be manifesting that our own life energy, because that does tap into the universal life energy. So, and we're all so connected. So, how would you say that Virginia's work? What would you say it offers people today?
Um, I think, I was listening to this presentation by an existential therapist named Rollo May, and he talked about the constant evolution of technique and what he called gimmicks. So his critique of this, the psychotherapeutic landscape, is there's, I don't know, 400, 500 different forms of therapy now, and it's constantly evolving. I think what Virginia offers is a framework, is a baseline grounding around, and she explored, and I think her work in presenting on the seed model is very important. That's why I reflect a lot on that part of her presentation, on that part of her work, because I think understanding what beliefs we carry about being itself, relationships itself, change itself, um, emotions, what are our beliefs about that, form the foundation for how we exist and then how we live. And I think seeing that there's a lot of creative potential there, that if we just rely on technique, then it's just become collectors of technique, but we're not sort of rooted in as much as we could be with our humanness. I think if we start from there, sometimes techniques can be invented or created as the situation demands, rather than these are my tools and I'm forcing a particular technique onto a person or a client. So I think, I think that's the use of self, the reflections on how important that was. And a lot of her work, what I understand, those 90-day workshops, she never emphasized like, I'm teaching people family therapy. She certainly did that. But in the intensive things, what people learned is how to open their eyes, how to really look, how to really be present, how to really project that energy and to be here, and to take risks. The 5 freedoms, I think, are a very important part of grounding those things, which update all the old family rules that freeze up senses or emotions or expression and movement. So yeah, I think Virginia Satir's work has a lot to offer. And I think having concepts to point to, like I would point to the concept of self-connection as a central part of her work. She would use language like self-esteem and self-worth. Now, self-esteem and self-worth, for anyone here that's a psychologist, has its own meaning. So when you try to talk about Virginia and you talk about self-worth and self-esteem, there'll be quickly a misunderstanding, because they think that you're talking about the feelings and perceptions of self, which is an abstraction. And it's an abstraction that changes through the developmental process, but it's temporary. And I think the things that, when we're talking about life energy or self, or the face you had before you were born, that there's something transcendent to that is rooting and grounding, that isn't about a particular form of consciousness, a particular thought. And that's the place, that's the basis for transformation, is connecting to that place. So
Okay. So, like connecting to that place, I think that maybe Banman would be saying we manifesting that we're co-creating and manifesting. And I know in Psychotherapy Networker, and not, I don't know how many years ago, there was a survey about what the most important thing is in any therapy of all those modalities. And it is the use of self. And that use of self that is our life, unique life force energy. So, I mean, and I think she would say that it's like it was never just her. She was manifesting her love energy, which meant that she was also in connection with the universal energy of then the wisdom. So that place of intuition and wisdom is is so important, right? I mean, if you're not,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm not with me, then I can't fully be with you.
Hmm.
So then, do you want to say anything about congruence, like what you're learning about congruence?
Yeah, I wanted to share a quick clinical example. I was working with someone, and just to kind of highlight, this person has had different experiences of trauma and abuse, and she was highlighting to me her realization, a deep realization that um, she was hearing her no's her whole life, but she'd never learned to value it. What she learned to value was the family rule of make them happy, uh, submit, placate. And so Virginia talked about these as survival coping stances. So that the rigidity of the pattern is for the sake of life. It's the best that that person could come up with at that point as a child. And the part of her that was saying, no, no, that doesn't fit. No, I don't want this. That was however quiet it was. That's the place of the self, and the construction of the pattern, the survival coping. That's the stuff at the branches. And so anyway, that's one example of this relationship that we have. There's this place that's um, a mystery almost, and it's quiet, but it's loyal, and it's always been there. And it's the same no, but we can lose touch with that. And I had this, as I was coming home from a jog yesterday, I had this weird phrase that came to my mind, and it was divine dissociation. Divine dissociation. I thought, what the hell does that mean? And I think it's like if everything starts as one, if everything starts as everything, and let's use the word God, it's like being has to dissociate itself so that it can be loving towards itself. So I see that in that example where it's like a, a, a person disconnects from themselves. They create this pattern, but the loving process is reconnecting. You lose yourself to find yourself. Um, so I think that we're all on this journey of trying to remember who we are. And so anyways, that's why I like the phrase self-connection. I think it points better than
So
self-esteem.
how would that fit with the metaphor of the tree? You know, like I'm no longer my roles, but I'm only the roots, or I'm the earth, I'm the air.
Well,
Like if I'm
well, I
losing
think,
myself to find myself.
yeah, well, it's it's like an artist that produces art. Once they release that into the world, they have to let it go. They can't be attached to it anymore. So that gets into like Buddhist thought about attachment being a very important part of suffering. The human beings, we express things. Let's say we express in our work, or we express through our roles. I want to be a good parent. I want to be a good employee. um, but the roots remind us of who we really are, and you could think of your roots as your yearnings or your values. And when or the thing, that the part of you that says no when it really means no. When Virginia talked about the medallion, your real yeses and your real nos, this wisdom. And then we're living through that. We're trying to manifest through the roles, but the roles are very important. They're the expression of ourself. And so um, it's not anything that I want to take for granted. I think it's important, and I think that's where this kind of imagery, this kind of language helps me, because I know people want to be successful. I know people want to do a good job, but being able to communicate about that, it's like, yes, do that. Let's do a great job, but let's not lose connection to our roots. And just that, and Virginia would talk about, in helping couples, she would support them in staying on their feet. She would literally get them standing on their feet, because that's where they can practice being congruent. So I want to share. I was reading from Helping Families Change, which is a book that Virginia co-wrote in 1975, and she outlines her definition of congruence, which I thought was really cool. So the first is, congruence is the belief or conviction of the universality of the human being, our common humanity, and that we're all guaranteed similarity and differences. So that's pretty cool. She would often talk about.
Can you read that again, slower?
Congruence is the belief, the conviction of the universality of the human being, our common humanity. And we're all guaranteed, she talks about, we're all guaranteed similarity and differences. So the second part that she talked about is, and she emphasizes, the full use of the senses, the return to the senses. So that would be having people sit across from one another, to be closer to each other, to look and to hear, and then to maybe even touch. This is part of congruence. And the last is the full use of choice. And I've often reflected, I think, choice, sort of playing off the word mindfulness, I think about choicefulness. This is a resource that we're constantly engaged with. And Virginia often talked about, if you're stuck with one option, you're just stuck. And if you're stuck with two, it's still a dilemma. You don't have a full choice until you have three options. And the full use of your creativity, your intelligence, your wisdom occurs in your access and your exercising of choice as a resource. So this is, I think, is a very helpful pointer towards congruence. And the word congruence has a relationship to how I think about self-connection. I think self-connection is the inner work, and congruence is the expression of that inner work out. So that's what I would say is a relationship. So the opposite of congruence, incongruence, is not being in touch with what is universally human, not being in touch with our senses, and not being in touch with the resource of choice. So that's just something that I've learned recently, and it's helped me sort of connect to what I've been working on in terms of self-connection, which is going to be the focus of the workshop, and a lot of the focus of the work I'm doing with people. It's a very grounding, centralizing concept that's it's very, very rich. So
yeah, okay. I know that Satir's meta goals, one of them is to be a better choice maker. And she actually talked about like the sacred yes and the sacred no with the medallion. So then to get that sacredness, we're listening to the whisper of our wisdom, or sometimes the yelling of our life force saying yes or no. You know, it comes out of our mouth sometimes before we even are like, whoa, that's a really strong yes or no.
And I think to take the risk to listen to that energy, that voice, takes time. It takes a lot of nurturing. It takes a lot of love and support. And I think that's what she modeled so well. And I think anyone that studied her work for a long time, I think, has the benefit of seeing that relationship. She's very active in the therapy, but also very able to create a holding space for people. So
yeah, she referred to herself, and she referred to us, people that are working with people, as change artists. So in that, she believed that we really needed to be, or she knew that we needed to be in that right part of our brain, because that's where we have real access to our creativity and our intuition. So Tim, you have been referring to this melting the iceberg, and it's been a little bit of a hot topic. Do you want to say a little bit about that? A hot
that's
melting iceberg.
a hot melting. Well, I think the first thing I'd say is anyone that's seen her work, I have an intuition, and this is I have an intuition. Obviously, I never met her. I don't talk to her. I just don't know. I don't know how well the metaphor of an iceberg fits with a woman that was so warm. She manifested warmth, and she was so felt in the sense of touch. I think about. I had this experience of grounding. One day I was going for a walk, and I picked up some ice, and I held it, and and it was, uncomfortable, but I just waited until that piece of the block of ice that I held melted, and it reminded me that I was alive. There's a warmth in me that no matter what I'm experiencing, perhaps of anger or depression, that there's something warm within me, that yes, I see a comment. Warmth is what melts the iceberg. And then we're talking about attachment. We're talking about the holding space. And for me, the iceberg is a very good assessment tool for seeing and looking at what's the pattern here. So you could look at Virginia's survival coping stances: blaming, placating, super reasonable, irrelevant, and you could walk through the iceberg and say, okay, how does this look? What's the behavior? What's the feeling? What's the feelings about feelings? That's a useful exercise, and grounding in, how is this person coping? The other thing to realize about the iceberg is, it's arbitrary what elements, what forms of consciousness are there. There are many things you could throw in there. For example, memories. You could throw family rules in there. There's any form of consciousness could potentially fit in there. So I think having the flexibility and the awareness that the iceberg is a useful tool, but we shouldn't restrain ourselves to a particular pattern, because if we become patternized, then our thinking sort of gets deadened by that. The other thing that I realized early on, when I was first doing trainings, was, what's the relationship between ingredients of an interaction and the iceberg? And they're actually pointing at the same thing, if you think about it. But I think the evolution of the iceberg would benefit from the interactive nature of it. Right now, the iceberg is, I'm thinking about a particular person's consciousness. But because Virginia's work related to systems and family systems and community systems, I think, and this is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around, about a good metaphor for that representation. But yeah, how can the metaphor also represent responses and the interactional nature? So the melting for me is a good way to signify transformation. And the way that I like to represent what happens after that transformation is water, but also from biology. If you look at what a cell is, if you look at just a single cell, a cell has a nucleus. And the nucleus you could see as like the self. It gives the instruction to the rest of the cell. And all the other forms of consciousness take guidance and leadership from that self. So that's a way of thinking about it that I found helpful, rather than thinking about everything being frozen. I want to think about all the forms of my consciousness as being amenable to my values and my yearnings and my choice-making ability. So that's how it lands for me, and that's what I offer and what I would talk about and explore. The other reason why melting is important is because I've identified, in relationship to Virginia's change process, particular universal resources that I talk about being the function and the process of transformation or melting. So that's the other part of it.
So are you saying sort of like the iceberg? I mean, it is sort of a tool in a way, and it is a metaphor for a person. And yet sort of what we're hoping for in this, like manifesting our life energy, is that we are a drop of water in the ocean, and we are the ocean. So we're not necessarily always the iceberg. We have moments where we're in reaction or we're triggered, where then it's very useful to say, what happened? What was I expecting? How did I see myself? What yearning do I have that I didn't know that I want to get met? And then when we're in that state of oneness, I guess, which is like the whole ocean, then it's melted. So it's sort of it goes back and forth. Is that what you're saying? It's sort of like,
Yeah, yeah. There's a dynamic relationship between form and essence, right? There's times. So the other part of this thought comes from my inspiration and appreciation for Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was a famous martial artist, which I think everyone knows who that is. And he has this quote. He says, "Be like water. You know, you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a teapot, it becomes a teapot. It can flow, so it can be soft, but it can also crash. It could carve stone. So that's interesting, right? So and the essence of if you think about your physical body, what's flowing right now? Hopefully everything, digestion, blood, your immune system, like your neurotransmitters. You want flow. And that's, flow is the word used to describe higher states of consciousness and the integration of the balance between skill and challenge. So I think, I think water and flow are appropriate ways, are fitting ways to describe at least my experience of Virginia. And I think hopefully that makes sense to people. And Sharon, she sent me a note. She said, because we've been talking about these things for years now, Sharon Lotion, and she said she was working with someone and the image of ice came up and the client decided to melt it. So, I mean, that's come up for me many, many times where that's an appropriate sort of metaphor. A client says, I've been feeling really depressed and I felt completely frozen. I felt stuck. Stuck in what? A particular way of behaving, a particular way of feeling, a particular way of expecting, right? So that's the rigidity. What's the transformation? The transformation is being able to look at that. And Virginia talked about, I wish everyone had a tail with an eyeball on the end of it so they could look, right? So the externalization of awareness. And that process of looking is the melting. It's like, hey, there's that. And the relating to that is like love, it's connection. It's like, okay, I love the fact that whatever I did to survive when I was 5 was the best thing I could come up with. And I love that. I can appreciate that. Now I'm going to hold your hand. Let's move to something else. So that's the way I saw, and I understand that she worked. So melting is a very important concept to bridge my sort of beginning understanding of the iceberg and trying to move it along.
Yeah, I like that. And so really then as a human being, we will always have the iceberg metaphor for ourselves. And we will always have the potential and the ability to be water, steam, whatever water form, the flow. So we have both. I think in the beginning you said it's like you would hope like how the Satir model could be helpful is like to sort of provide either a structure or almost like a linear understanding that was languaged in a way that more people could understand it. So it seems like the iceberg is sort of a little bit like that metaphor that people can maybe better understand and know themselves so they can like maybe reach and manifest your life force energy. I would hope maybe more easily, but
yes, because I think Virginia was obviously such a power. She was a master therapist, so she was so effective with people. And once they had an experience with her, they would change or they would grow. People would change. But I think having, when I teach and when I do workshops, I will do a little bit of intellectual sort of explanation. Here's the model, here's sort of thing, and then we do the experience. And then, but when we do the experience, it's like I'm asking you to take a risk to do something different and maybe strange, but front loading it with some conceptual understanding gives people confidence to say, okay, he's put some thought into this. We're not just doing this thing, right? Whereas, Virginia, I think her way in was she was so warm and trusting. She'd take people by the hand. It's like, okay, we're going to do this thing. And she was so effective in doing it that way. So that works. But what I'm suggesting is that a stronger theoretical grounding can also be another doorway in, and it has sort of a wider reach. And I think will help people really understand how amazing Virginia was and how powerful her ideas and her approach can be. So that's really my hope that I can contribute to that in some way.
so that's sort of that question is like, what do you think could help spread her word? Her word, her work, her model. And I think that's the answer is maybe a theoretical understanding more. I don't know if you want to say anything else you want to say about that.
Yeah, I think more and more integration, perhaps with how we understand experience, phenomenology, neuroscience, like what is kind of current, bringing it sort of in relationship to that. That's why, for example, the use of language that she used at the time, self-worth and self-esteem, I hope to just change the pointer, because I think, for example, if we use language of self-connection, there's a novelty and you can invent new meaning, which is what she was doing with those words. But because there's already definitions of those words, there could be confusion. And so people can dismiss her and say, oh, self-esteem, oh, just the self-esteem movement. Like that's so like that's 1980. That's like that hasn't worked. The research hasn't borne out that that's effective. But that's not what she was doing. She wasn't working superficially with just changing people's thoughts about themselves and them doing affirmations. It was a lot deeper than that. So I'm hoping to capture that.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, before she even used self-esteem, I think that was coined later on. She used the pot.
Yeah.
Like, what's your pot? Like, what's going on inside of you? Your pot being like, what is it? She said the three S's: soup, soap, or shit. Because we have all of them.
Yes.
I did that in an interview. It's like, and then that sort of like developed into sort of self-esteem because that was sort of the buzzword.
But even in that analogy, what Virginia's emphasizing is the content of the pot. What she
Right.
also did at other times is she would talk about the universal life force energy, which would be more the space, the fact that the pot has space in it. What's that
Yes.
space? That is a container for possibility. But you don't, she would often, and she was one of the first people to externalize, you are not your experience. So even though you're feeling like shit, even though shit is in the pot, you are not that. So again, that this is where she was onto something, but sometimes the way she would explain it would sound like the psychological definition of self-esteem. And sometimes the other ways that she would describe it, she would transcend that. And um, I think sort of clarifying that is important.
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
too. Good.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, maybe your last question. What do you think Satir communities could do better to grow in the expression of congruence?
um, I'm feeling stumped, and I came up with that question, so I'm like a bit embarrassed. I think it's embody the stuff that she taught. Right at the end of the day, it's like it's not. We all know it's not enough to have the insight and to know it up here, but to embody it and to practice it. This is very important. I would like to see, for example, in these kind of community meetings or in any workshop, that the five freedoms really be emphasized and say like this is going to help us if we give ourselves freedom to see and to feel and to ask and to say and to take risks. The one thing that I would add to the five freedoms is the freedom to move. That's a particular one because I'm very interested in movement and the body. So I would tack that in. So I've sort of adapted the five freedoms so it stays five. So anyways, that's
Yeah,
that's
good.
another thought, but I think that's really important.
She would say that to love and to be real. And I think with the Satir Institute, one of the things that we've really been evolving is to what we call live our brand, our brand of congruence. How can we live it at all levels of the board, the executive, in our trainings as a trainer, as members of the SIP community, and just in the world. So like living that brand of like we represent and we, Satir said that it's like, this is something to live. It's not just a thing to practice in your therapy sessions. The Satir model is a way of being, and that being level is at the level of self.
I
So,
I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of creating organizations. I have friends that work in nonprofits, and I used to work in nonprofits. Now I'm in private practice, but like we do not know how to do healthy organizations yet. There's so much to learn, and so much to learn from Virginia about integrating that in our way of being. The most you would think ideal, the most humanistic and valuing of people, organizations sometimes fall really short of perceiving and beholding the human being. So I think that's extremely important, and it requires the high competence in communication and self-connection. I think any good relationship depends on two key ingredients, maybe more. I'm still working on it, but self-awareness and communication skills, or self-connection and communication skill. So, yeah, that's a lot.